Alright, if you're watching this alone in the dark, you're either really brave or you forgot to turn the lights on. Either way, welcome to Tales Nameless, where true horror stories creep through your headphones and linger in the corners of your mind. So, before the shadows get a little too close, hit that subscribe button. It's the only thing that keeps them away. Or, so I've heard. Welcome to the darkness. You're in the right place. Welcome back to Tales Nameless. Tonight, I invite you to turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare for a journey into the darkest corners of the human mind. These are the tales whispered in the shadows, the stories that keep you looking over your shoulder long after the lights have gone out. So, if you're ready for a sleepless night, join me for these 5 terrifying true horror stories. Story 1: The Forest in the Mist. You ever been alone on a deserted road, the kind where the trees close in around you, and the darkness seems thicker, almost alive? That's exactly where I found myself one foggy night, driving back from my cousin's cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The clock had just ticked past midnight, and the road twisted like a serpent, its curves hidden by thick, rolling fog that clung to the trees like ghostly tendrils. My only company was the low hum of my engine and the steady, rhythmic thump of my tires against the cracked asphalt. The fog was so dense it felt alive, shifting and swirling like a living thing as it curled around my car. It clung to the windshield in slow, creeping tendrils, casting ghostly shadows against the glass. The yellowish beams from my headlights seemed to carve tunnels through the mist, revealing little more than the twisted silhouettes of tree branches that reached out like skeletal fingers. Every crack and dip in the road sent a jolt through my steering wheel, my knuckles tightening with each bump. The darkness felt oppressive, pressing in from all sides, as if the night itself had a weight I couldn't shake off. It started as a shadow, a quick flicker in my rearview mirror. I glanced back instinctively, but the back seat was empty, just the faint outline of my worn leather seats. I shook my head, brushing it off as a trick of the fog and my tired eyes. But then it happened again. A darker patch in the swirling mist, a hint of movement just behind my shoulder. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles glowing white in the dim light of my dashboard. The air in the car felt colder, heavier, pressing down on my chest like a wet blanket. Then, the radio crackled, a burst of static that sent a chill racing down my spine. I reached out to adjust the dial, my fingers trembling slightly, but the sound only grew louder, hissing and whispering in a way that reminded me of distant voices echoing through the mist. I turned the volume knob down, but the whispering persisted, growing clearer, as if someone were sitting right behind me, leaning in close. I forced myself to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something or someone was riding along with me, just out of sight, just out of reach. I turned up the radio, hoping a bit of static-laden rock would drown out my growing anxiety, but it only made things worse. The music crackled, then cut out completely, replaced by a low, whispering hiss. My breath caught in my throat as I reached to adjust the dial, but the sound only grew louder, like someone leaning in close to my ear. "Keep your eyes on the road." The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was there, undeniable, curling around me like the mist outside. I nearly swerved off the road. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a thunderous drum that drowned out the hum of my engine. I shot a glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a face, pale and gaunt, staring back at me. But there was nothing, just shadows and the faint outline of my jacket crumpled against the door. I turned my eyes back to the road, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The fog seemed thicker now, its ghostly fingers reaching into my car, curling around my shoulders like a cold, damp embrace. Heart racing, I whipped my head around, eyes straining against the darkness, half expecting to see a pale face staring back at me. But the back seat was empty, just shadows, and the faint outline of my jacket crumpled against the door. I turned back to the road just in time to swerve around a sharp corner, my tires skidding on the damp pavement. My pulse thudded in my ears, each beat a hammer blow against my temples. I forced my gaze forward, ignoring the burning urge to check the back seat again. But the darkness around me felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing in on me from all sides. The mist clung to the car windows like wet spider silk, and the faint bitter smell of damp earth and rotting leaves seeped into the cabin, filling my nostrils with every shallow breath. The radio crackled again, this time spitting out a burst of static that almost sounded like a distant scream, cut off abruptly as I sped through a narrow curve. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my fingers aching, the leather creaking under the pressure. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, a soft, raspy whisper echoed from the back seat. Close, too close. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end as a chill washed over me. The voice came again, clearer this time, just a breath away. Slow down. You're not alone. I shot a glance at the rearview mirror, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the roar of the engine. The fog behind me seemed to thicken, its swirling tendrils pulling back like curtains to reveal the faint outline of a figure, slumped, shadowed, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. For a split second, I caught the glint of hollow black eyes staring back at me, lips twisted into a wide, lipless grin. I slammed the gas pedal down, the engine roaring as I sped into the darkness, the figure in the mirror dissolving back into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. As I approached the last stretch of road before the lights of my small town came into view, the fog thinned, retreating into the trees like a living thing. I let out a shaky breath, feeling the tightness in my chest loosen slightly. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the reflection, was the faint outline of a face, hollow eyes, a wide, lipless grin, staring back at me from the darkness of the back seat. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. When I turned around, the back seat was empty again, but my phone buzzed in the cup holder. A new message, a picture of me, taken from the back seat, my terrified face lit up by the glow of my dashboard. If this story left you with a chill, don't forget to hit the like button, share your own creepy encounters in the comments, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales like this one. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road and watch the back seat. Story 2. The Silent Watcher. There's something different about a park after dark. The daytime laughter of children and the chatter of dog walkers fades into an eerie, whispering silence as the sun sets. Shadows stretch longer. The wind rustles through the leaves like a cautious whisper, and every creaking branch or rustling leaf feels like a warning. That's exactly what Mark felt every time he jogged through Golden Gate Park in San Francisco after his late shifts at the hospital. The air was cool, the path dimly lit by sporadic street lamps, their cones of light barely cutting through the fog that rolled in from the bay. He told himself he enjoyed the solitude, the quiet moments when the world felt smaller. But the truth was, something about those late-night runs always set his nerves on edge. Mark's sneakers crunched against the gravel path, the sound echoing through the empty park. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their twisted branches casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. He adjusted his headphones, letting the steady beat of his workout playlist drown out the unsettling creaks and rustles around him. But as he rounded a bend near the old rose garden, the music cut out abruptly, replaced by a low, static hiss. He frowned, tapping at his phone, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. Then, just at the edge of his vision, he caught a flicker of movement, a shadow slipping behind a tree. He slowed his pace, breath misting in the cool air, his senses suddenly sharp. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his pulse quickening as his eyes scanned the dimly lit path behind him. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but the sense of being watched clung to him like a cold, damp blanket. He turned back to the path ahead, forcing himself to keep moving, but then he heard it, the unmistakable crunch of gravel, faint but steady, keeping pace just a few steps behind him. He spun around, his breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. Nothing. Just the wind whispering through the trees and the distant hum of the city beyond the park's edge. Mark shook his head, chuckling nervously. "Get a grip, man," he muttered, picking up his pace. The footsteps returned, louder this time, closer. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, his pulse thundering in his ears. He whipped his head around again, and this time he caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, shadowy, just beyond the reach of the nearest street lamp. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Mark's breath hitched, a cold sweat breaking out along his spine. He stumbled forward, his shoes skidding on the loose gravel, his lungs burning as he sucked in the damp night air. The footsteps quickened, matching his frantic pace, closing the gap with every panicked stride. He glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes straining against the darkness. The figure had closed the distance, its face still hidden in shadow, but its eyes, cold, unblinking, locked onto his, glinted like polished glass in the faint moonlight. Mark's legs burned, his muscles screaming for relief, but he pushed harder, his heart a wild drumbeat against his ribs. He could hear the figure's ragged breaths now, echoing his own so close he could almost feel the heat of its gaze on the back of his neck. He rounded a corner, the trees thinning as the park's main path came into view, the distant glow of the street lamps like a beacon in the darkness. Just a little farther, he thought, his lungs heaving, his vision blurring at the edges. Just a few more steps. But the figure didn't slow, didn't falter. Its footsteps grew louder, heavier, almost deliberate, like the ticking of a massive broken clock. Mark's vision blurred, black spots dancing at the edges of his sight as the adrenaline burned through his veins. He stumbled, his foot catching on a loose stone, and he crashed to the ground, his palms scraping against the jagged gravel. Pain flared in his hands, hot and sharp, but he forced himself to his feet, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gulps. He didn't dare look back. The footsteps were so close now he could feel the vibration of each heavy stride, could almost taste the cold, metallic tang of fear in his mouth. The path ahead twisted sharply, disappearing into a tunnel of overhanging branches, their skeletal fingers clawing at the fog like desperate hands. He plunged into the darkness, the air colder here, damp and heavy, clinging to his skin like wet silk. His pulse pounded in his ears, his heart a frantic, stuttering drumbeat. He felt the presence close behind him, its icy breath tickling the back of his neck, its footsteps deafening in the enclosed space. Just when he thought he could run no more, when his legs threatened to give out beneath him, the path opened up, the trees pulling back to reveal the bright, welcoming glow of the street lamps. Mark burst through the park's exit, his feet slamming against the cracked pavement of the city sidewalk. He doubled over, hands on his knees, gasping for air, his heart a frantic drumbeat in his chest. He glanced back, expecting to see the shadowy figure emerging from the trees, but the path behind him was empty. He fumbled for his phone, the cold glass slick with sweat as he brought the screen to life. A new notification, a photo. His blood ran cold as he opened it. The picture showed him, just moments earlier, running through the fog-shrouded park, the shadowy figure mere inches behind him, its eyes glinting like polished glass, its mouth twisted into a wide, lipless grin. If this story left you looking over your shoulder, don't forget to hit the like button, share your own creepy encounters in the comments, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales like this one. Until next time, stay safe and never look back. Story 3. The Diner at the Edge of Nowhere. Jane had worked the graveyard shift at a small, roadside diner in the Nevada desert for over a decade. She'd seen all kinds of people stumble in from the highway, truckers with bloodshot eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, drifters looking for a cheap cup of coffee, even the occasional hitchhiker with a backpack full of questionable belongings. The kind of people who carried their lives in the creases of their clothes, their eyes hollow from long, sleepless nights behind the wheel or endless miles of empty desert. She was used to their gruff voices, their tired nods, the clink of loose change tossed onto the counter as they muttered a quick thanks before disappearing back into the night. But this man was different. But nothing had ever unsettled her quite like the man who walked in just after 3 a.m. on a cold, windy night in late November. The bell above the diner door gave a sharp, metallic ring as the man entered, his boots crunching against the worn linoleum floor. He was tall and thin, his frame swallowed by a long, ragged coat that looked more like a pile of discarded rags than actual clothing. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, and his hands, long skeletal things, hung limp at his sides. The wind howled through the cracked door frame as he stepped inside, bringing with it a blast of icy air that cut through the diner like a knife. Jane shivered, the fine hairs on her arms standing on end as the door swung shut behind him with a heavy, shuddering thud. She felt the temperature drop by several degrees, the warmth of the kitchen light seeming to shrink back from his presence, casting long, jagged shadows across the checkered tile floor. Jane felt a shiver run down her spine as his boots scuffed against the tiles, each step deliberate, each movement slow and calculated, as if he were feeling his way through the room by sound alone. Jane forced a smile as the man slid onto a stool at the far end of the counter, his head turning slowly to face her. She couldn't see his eyes beneath the shadow of his hat, but she felt them on her, cold and unblinking. She grabbed a clean coffee cup from the stack beside the register, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the thick, black liquid. "Late night?" she asked, her voice coming out a bit too high, too strained. The man didn't respond. He simply tilted his head, the shadow of his hat dipping lower, obscuring his face even further. The air around him felt wrong, heavy, almost oppressive, like the thick, humid air before a summer storm. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck prickling, a cold sweat breaking out along her spine. She forced herself to keep moving, to pretend she didn't notice the way his head tilted slightly, following her every move with that unblinking, unseen gaze. She set the cup down in front of him, her breath catching as his gloved hand twitched, the long, bony joints cracking loudly in the stillness of the diner. His hand curled around the mug, his grip unnaturally tight, the leather creaking as his fingers tightened around the ceramic. Jane felt her pulse quicken as he brought the cup to his lips, the shadow beneath his hat deepening, the darkness seeming to swallow the steam rising from the coffee. Jane watched, her pulse quickening, as he took a long, slow sip, the coffee disappearing into the darkness beneath his hat. When he set the cup back down, a faint, wet, slurping sound echoed from the shadows beneath his brim. Jane felt her stomach twist as the man leaned closer, the brim of his hat casting long, jagged shadows across the counter. His breath, cold and damp, brushed against her cheek as he whispered, his voice low and rasping, like dry leaves scraping against pavement. "Do you know what it's like?" he hissed, his words stretching out into the stale air between them. "To be truly alone?" The lights above the counter flickered, the harsh fluorescent bulbs buzzing angrily, as if protesting his presence. Jane took another step back, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the coffee pot, her knuckles whitening as she gripped it tight. She felt her heart skip a beat as the man leaned even closer, his breath chilling her skin, his whisper slithering around her like a serpent. "It's cold," he rasped, his voice slipping into her ears, his breath coiling around her neck like a noose. "So very cold." Jane stumbled back, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She grabbed the phone beside the register, her fingers shaking so badly she nearly dropped it as she punched in the number for the local sheriff. She glanced back at the counter, expecting to see the rusty key, the small blood-stained piece of metal that had appeared from the depths of the stranger's coat. But the counter was empty, the key gone, the stool vacant. The bell above the door gave a final, forlorn chime as it swung to a stop, and the wind outside picked up, howling against the glass like a distant, mournful wail. Jane felt a cold, creeping dread settle into her bones. She looked down at her trembling hands, her breath catching in her throat as she realized they were stained, dark, sticky, and wet, the rusty metallic scent of old blood filling her nostrils. She stumbled back, her foot catching on the edge of a torn floor mat, and she crashed against the counter, the phone slipping from her grasp as she clutched at the edge of the counter to keep from falling. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, the room spinning around her as the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, the neon sign outside casting flickering red light through the window, painting the walls in bloody, wavering patterns. If this story left you with a chill, don't forget to hit the like button, share your own eerie encounters in the comments, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales like this one. Until next time, keep the coffee hot and the doors locked. Story 4. The Watcher in the Window. There's an old house in the hills, just outside of town, a crumbling Victorian with peeling paint and shattered windows that stare blankly into the overgrown yard. It's the kind of place kids dare each other to approach on Halloween, the kind of place whispered about over campfires and flashlight-lit sleepovers. The wind around the house always seemed to blow a little colder, the shadows a bit darker, as if the place itself resented being remembered. Weeds twisted up through the cracked foundation, their gnarled roots clinging to the crumbling brick like desperate fingers, and the air around the old house felt thick, oppressive, carrying the faint, bitter scent of charred wood and old ashes. But for Daniel, it wasn't just a ghost story. It was his childhood home. He hadn't set foot in the place for over 20 years, not since his parents had died in a fire that gutted the east wing, leaving the house a charred, hollow shell of its former self. He still remembered the night he'd watched the flames lick up the sides of the old house, the heat so intense it had seared his face even from the safety of the gravel driveway, his mother's screams echoing over the crackle of burning wood. But when he received a letter, postmarked from his hometown telling him that the property had been put up for auction, something pulled him back, a nagging, unshakable need to see the old house one last time. Daniel parked his truck at the base of the hill, the engine ticking as it cooled in the chilly autumn air. He stared up at the house, its dark silhouette etched against the overcast sky, its twisted, gnarled spires clawing at the low gray clouds. The air felt different here, heavier, each breath dragging cold, damp tendrils into his lungs. He glanced around, the wind picking up as if whispering warnings through the swaying branches of the dead, gnarled trees that dotted the hillside. The truck's headlights cast long, wavering shadows across the cracked stone steps, the weeds swaying like ghostly fingers in the breeze. He took a deep breath, the air sharp and cold in his lungs, and started up the winding, weed-choked path that led to the front porch. The wind rustled through the dead leaves piled against the cracked stone steps, whispering secrets of the past as it swirled around his feet. As he reached the front door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the rusted doorknob, the metal cold and rough beneath his fingertips. He felt a chill seep into his bones, the kind that made his skin prickle and his breath catch in his throat. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement in the cracked, dirt-streaked glass of the front window, a shadow, long and thin, slipping back into the darkness just beyond the threshold, the glass warping and shifting as if the house itself were breathing, watching, waiting. The door creaked open with a shuddering groan, the rusted hinges protesting his intrusion as Daniel stepped into the front hall. Dust motes swirled in the weak, gray light that seeped through the broken windows, their slow, lazy dance disturbed by the cold draft that swept through the house. The air was thick, heavy, carrying with it the faint, bitter scent of charred wood and damp rot. He moved slowly, his boots echoing off the cracked, peeling floorboards, each step a reminder of the countless times he'd run through these halls as a child, his laughter ringing against the now silent walls. He paused at the base of the grand staircase, his eyes tracing the twisted, splintered banister, the once polished wood now dull and scarred. He felt a chill creep up his spine as he noticed the faint, blackened handprints that dotted the railing, the smudges of soot and ash smeared like desperate claw marks against the wood. He continued deeper into the house, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floors, his breath misting in the frigid air. As he passed the cracked, dirt-streaked windows that lined the hallway, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end, the unmistakable sensation of being watched creeping over him like a cold, damp blanket. He paused beside the old grandfather clock, its glass face shattered, its hands frozen at the exact moment the fire had gutted the house all those years ago. The silence around him felt oppressive, almost sentient, each shadow seeming to stretch and twist as if reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the heart of the house. As he reached the second-floor landing, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper, stretching out from the corners of the rooms like grasping hands. Daniel paused, his breath misting in the frigid air, his heart pounding in his chest as a low, distant whisper echoed down the hallway. A child's voice, thin and wavering, calling his name. He whipped his head around, his pulse thundering in his ears. But the hallway was empty, the doors lining the walls dark and silent. He took a step back, his hand gripping the splintered banister, the rough wood biting into his palm. The whisper came again, closer this time, the voice rising to a frantic, desperate pitch. He spun around, his eyes locking onto the cracked, dust-covered mirror hanging at the end of the hall. For a moment, he thought he saw his own reflection, pale, wide-eyed, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. But then the image twisted, the face in the mirror changing, its features warping into something hollow, twisted, its eyes dark and empty, its mouth stretching into a wide, lipless grin. Daniel stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose floorboard, his arms flailing as he crashed against the wall. The mirror shattered, the sound like a gunshot in the still, heavy air, shards of glass raining down around him as the whispering rose to a deafening roar. Daniel staggered back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, his hand scraping against the splintered wall as he struggled to keep his balance. He glanced back down the hallway, his heart racing, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears. He felt the cold fingers of fear tighten around his heart as the shadows in the corners seemed to shift, to move, stretching toward him like hungry, grasping hands. The mirror was shattered, the glass scattered across the floor, each jagged shard reflecting his terrified, wide-eyed face. But as he turned to run, his eyes flicked to the nearest window and froze. There, staring back at him, was the twisted, hollow-eyed face from the mirror, its lipless grin stretching impossibly wide, its dark, empty eyes locked onto his. If this story left you looking over your shoulder, don't forget to hit the like button, share your own eerie encounters in the comments, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales like this one. Until next time, remember, some doors should stay closed. Story 5. The roadside motel. Emma had been on the road for hours, her eyes stinging from the glare of oncoming headlights, her neck stiff from leaning over the wheel. She'd been driving since dawn, the miles ticking by as the landscape blurred into a monotonous stretch of empty fields and distant mountains. Her fingers ached from gripping the steering wheel, her mind foggy with fatigue, each mile blurring into the next as the sun dipped below the jagged mountains in the distance. She passed forgotten towns, their rusted, broken signs creaking in the wind, their main streets eerily deserted, the only signs of life the occasional flicker of a curtain in a darkened window or the faint, echoing bark of a distant dog. The road felt endless, each curve revealing only more empty fields and shadowed hills, the darkness pressing in around her like a thick, suffocating fog. When the neon sign for a roadside motel flickered into view through the dusty windshield, she let out a relieved sigh, her tired mind grasping at the promise of a hot shower and a warm bed. The sign buzzed and crackled in the dry desert air, its letters flickering sporadically. Vacancy, blinking weakly in sickly green and yellow. Emma pulled into the gravel lot, her tires crunching over the loose stones, the engine sputtering as she cut the ignition. She glanced around, the darkened windows of the motel staring back at her like hollow eyes, the wind whispering through the cracks in the crumbling stucco walls. The air felt colder here, sharper, as if the shadows themselves were reaching for her, wrapping around her like a damp, suffocating shroud. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle, a sudden, inexplicable chill creeping up her spine. The wind picked up, rustling the brittle sun-bleached weeds that sprouted from the cracked asphalt, sending a dry, hollow whisper through the parking lot. She shivered, her breath fogging the inside of the windshield, the hairs on her arms prickling beneath her jacket. But exhaustion won out, and she forced herself out of the car, the cool night air wrapping around her like a damp shroud. The motel office was as run down as the exterior suggested, flickering fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the walls stained yellow with decades of cigarette smoke, the linoleum floor sticky beneath her boots. Emma approached the front desk, the faded bell clinging weakly as she tapped it with her finger. The sound echoed off the cracked, nicotine-stained walls, the tinny ring cutting through the heavy silence like a rusted blade. She waited, her eyes drifting to the dusty plastic potted plant on the counter, its leaves coated in a thin film of grime. A forgotten relic from some long-past attempt to brighten the place up. Minutes passed, the silence around her growing thicker, heavier, pressing down on her chest like a weight. She glanced around, the overhead lights flickering in uneven, stuttering patterns, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched across the cracked linoleum like grasping hands. Just as she turned to leave, the door behind the counter creaked open, the hinges shrieking in protest as a thin, gray-haired man shuffled out, his eyes dull and unfocused, his clothes hanging off his thin frame like a scarecrow's rags. His skin seemed too tight for his bones, each movement sharp and unnatural, his eyes too bright in the flickering dying light. "Room for the night?" he croaked, his voice rough, the words scraping against the air like rusted metal. Emma forced a smile, nodding quickly as she pulled her wallet from her pocket. The old man's eyes tracked her movements, his pupils shrinking to pinpricks as he reached for the key hanging from the wall behind him. A heavy brass tag engraved with the number 7. He slid it across the counter, his bony fingers lingering for a moment as Emma reached for it, their hands brushing for a split second. The contact sent a sharp, icy jolt up her arm, her skin tingling as if tiny needles had pricked her flesh. She shivered, her breath catching in her throat as the man's thin lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile, his yellowed teeth flashing briefly in the flickering light. His grip felt wrong, too firm, his fingers curling around hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary, his breath hissing between his teeth as he whispered, "Room 7. Be careful." His skin was ice cold, the contact sending a jolt of electricity up her arm, her pulse quickening as a cold sweat broke out along her spine. Emma found her room at the far end of the dimly lit hallway, the door's paint chipped and peeling, the brass number 7 hanging crookedly from a single rusted nail. She fumbled with the key, her fingers trembling slightly as she forced it into the lock, the old metal grinding against the tumblers with a reluctant clunk. The door creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning like an old man's bones, the sound echoing down the narrow, shadow-choked hallway. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the darkened corners, the flickering light casting long, wavering shadows against the stained wallpaper. The air felt colder here, heavier, each breath dragging shards of icy dread into her lungs. The door swung open, the hinges groaning like a dying animal as she stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy, carrying the faint, metallic tang of rust and the musty scent of old wood. She flicked the light switch, the single overhead bulb flickering to life, casting long, wavering shadows across the faded floral wallpaper. She set her bag down on the bed, the old springs creaking beneath its weight, and took a deep breath, her nostrils filling with the sharp, acrid stench of mold and mildew. The walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness creeping along the edges of the flickering light, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things, their twisted, elongated shapes seeming to reach for her, their grasping fingers slipping just out of the reach of the weak, flickering light. Emma felt the room grow colder, the shadows thickening as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. She turned slowly, her breath catching as she noticed the mirror above the dresser. A dark, cracked surface that seemed to twist and warp in the dim light. She took a step back, her heart racing as she saw a shadow slip behind her in the reflection, just at the edge of her vision. The door behind her creaked slowly closed, the sound like a long, raspy breath. She spun around, her pulse pounding in her ears, her eyes locking onto the reflection once more. The figure was closer now, its hollow eyes fixed on her, its lipless grin stretching impossibly wide. Emma stumbled back, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the door handle, but it was too late. The shadows closed in, the darkness swallowing her last terrified scream. If this story left you with a chill, don't forget to hit the like button, share your own eerie encounters in the comments, and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales like this one. Until next time, remember, some doors should never be opened. Thank you for joining me tonight for these 5 chilling encounters. From mist-covered forests to forgotten roadside motels, I hope these stories left you looking over your shoulder. Which story gave you the biggest chills? Was it the eerie whispers in the mist, the silent watcher in the park, or perhaps the shadow in the motel mirror? Let me know in the comments which one kept you up the longest. If you enjoyed this journey into the darkness, please hit the like button, Share this video with your fellow night dwellers, and don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Your support helps keep the shadows alive and the stories coming. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some doors should never be opened.